Um, anyway, welcome everybody. I'm happy that you're joining us. I am Michael Soffer, the president of the Hyde Park Historical Society and the coordinator of the Hyde Park Book Club, along with Carol Veith and Dottie Jeffries. And tonight our guest is Peter Ascoli, who has written a biography of his grandfather, Julius Rosenwald. This is the book. Of course, many of you have already read it. Peter is a longtime Hyde Park resident. He has been very, very supportive of the Hyde Park Historical Society over the years. And we are just delighted that he agreed to join us tonight to talk about his biography of his grandfather and how this came about. So at this point, Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you very, very much, Michael. And thank you all for being here. I remember that shortly after my book was published in 2006, I received an award from the Hyde Park Historical Society. And I well remember the dinner at the Quad Club. It was a very nice event. And I thank you for that as well. I'm going to speak for maybe 30 minutes, maybe a little less. If I go over time, I hope you will give me the hook. So why did I write this book? I wrote it because I had a cousin who started doing research for a biography of Julius Rosenwald, who I call JR in the book because that's what his friends called him. His wife called him Jewel, but he liked to be called JR. And so that's what I've done. It's also easier to type than Rosenwald. In any case, my cousin Phil Stern started researching a book on Julius Rosenwald, and he started doing research at the archives at the University of Chicago, and he stayed at our home while he was doing some of this work. But he didn't get very, can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes.
He didn't get very far into it because a couple of years or a year or so after he started, he died of a brain tumor. And when I went to his funeral in Washington, I told his wife that I was interested in continuing the project, although at that very moment I wasn't sure. But about a year or so later, I left the job and decided that I would read the first biography, the only other biography that had been written about JR up to that point. And it was by a man named Maurice Werner, whom the family had chosen to write his biography. And he was a well-known biographer, but he was not, the book was okay, but it wasn't great according to my standards. And it was not a scholarly biography. And I decided that because I have a PhD in history from Berkeley, although it was in European history, that I would be able to write this book. So I started work at looking through the material at the University of Chicago. I went to a lot of other places, including, well, the Library of Congress, the Yale Library, for the Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. So a large number of places, and looked as much material as I could possibly find. My biggest find was in my aunt's home in New Orleans. My aunt Edith Stern had a home in New Orleans called Longview House and Gardens, which is a sort of museum. And in the attic of this house, there was a whole collection of archives, which nobody had really gone through systematically. And although I didn't go through it systematically, I went through as much of it as I could and there was a lot of really interesting material. I also went to the Museum of Science and Industry, which had an archive and contained a lot of very important and interesting material. So it took me 12 years to research, write, and edit the book. And it was published in 2006. When Indiana University Press agreed to publish it, I think they thought that it would be a book that maybe would last about a year or two, but it is still in print after all these years, over 15 years. So I'm really pretty proud of that. Anyway, what was the most impressive thing or interesting thing that I found? It wasn't in my research. It was when I went around and started talking about the book, and it was the fact that African Americans believed that Roebuck was Black, which he was not. He was a white watchmaker from Indiana, but there is a belief, I think still today in the Black community, that Roebuck was African American. It was because JR, as many of you know, was important in assisting and working with African Americans. And so they would like to think that an aspect of his life at Sears had to do with somebody who was African American. But I think that the way this rumor got started is that in many small rural communities, particularly in the South, which small stores were competing against Sears Roebuck, and they couldn't really compete. People they would pay kids to get copies of the Sears catalog and burn them. And so I think that the rumor in the white community got around that Roebuck was African American, so whites would not buy from Sears, but instead would buy from local stores. Anyway, that's the most surprising thing that I found. What I'd like to do now is to tell you, I'm not going to go into JR's life because you've read about it, but I'd like to tell you why I think he was truly important. He was a path breaker in 3 ways. First of all, as a businessman. He didn't create Sears Roebuck. It was created by Richard Sears. He came to it in 1895, and he became president and CEO in 1908 when Richard Sears left the company that he had created. What was important about JR really was his corporate style. Unlike many CEOs of big companies, it wasn't a top-down operation. The way he conducted business was with a sort of cabinet, almost like a president. He had a group of trusted advisors, and he listened to them. They gave him advice. People like Albert Loeb, who was very important at Sears. He really was sort of the second in command. He also was the father of Richard Loeb, the famous Loeb of Leopold and Loeb. And there were others. Another in the kitchen cabinet, if you will, was JR's brother-in-law, Max Adler, who was the founder of the Adler Planetarium. And there were several other people who were involved in the top echelons at Sears. And Loeb would, for example, was the person who gave him the idea of the profit-sharing plan, which wasn't unique among US companies, but JR had the most liberal and well thought out plan, which enabled people who were in Sears for a while to retire really very comfortably. And in a sense, it was designed because JR hated unions. And although he didn't do anything such as Pullman or anybody like that. And I mean, he was okay with them, but he didn't want to have a union at Sears, and he wanted to create conditions that were so good that people wouldn't want to leave it, or wouldn't want to strike for more pay, because the pay was, once you had been there for a little while, the pay was pretty good. And his door was always open. He listened to to advice and suggestions from other employees. And I'll just tell you one anecdote, which may be apocryphal, but one of his great admirers was Forbes, the founder of Forbes magazine, who would love to write articles about him. And one of these articles contained an anecdote of when JR was leaving Sears one day with a friend, and they were outside the store on Holman Avenue, the big plant, and they saw thousands of employees streaming out of the Sears plant. And the friend turned to JR and said, "Mr. Rosenwald, how does it feel to have all these people working for you?" And JR replied, "They don't work for me, they work with me." And this was, I mean, there weren't a lot of other CEOs in that day that really had that kind of attitude towards their workforce or towards their company. There are other examples of how the amount of money that he gave to Sears. I mean, he was very honest. He created the first testing lab because he wanted to make sure that every word in the catalog was absolutely honest, which had not been true under Richard Sears, nor was it true for many other mail order catalogs. Okay, the second realm in which he really was a path breaker was in philanthropy. He created the Rosenwald Fund in 1917 because, partly I think because he was asked to be on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation and thought that he could do a better job than Rockefeller. And he created it largely to run his school building program, which I'll go into a tiny bit more detail in a minute. In any case, the fund was went along until 1928, and then it was
Right.
Peter, could I ask you to unmute yourself? I muted everybody because we were getting background noise.
There.
Thank you.
okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry. Where were you when I got muted? Oh, well, okay. So in philanthropy, he was a path breaker because he created the first foundation to go out of existence voluntarily. Foundations were relatively new in this period, and nobody else had thought of doing this. And the reason that so he insisted that the foundation had to end within 25 years of his death. And that actually happened, although it ended a little bit earlier because of the Depression. It had lost a lot of money during the Depression. In any case, and I think that this was truly important. And why did he do this? He did it because he didn't believe in what he called perpetuities. He didn't want the foundation to go on forever because, as he said in a series of articles in the Atlantic, that he thought that the needs of the time would change, and you couldn't foresee what was going to happen. And he was afraid that his heirs would run the foundation in ways that he wouldn't have approved of. And so he insisted that the foundation should end, and the Rosenwald Fund did end in 1948 and became the first American foundation to what philanthropists now call sunset, meaning to go out of existence. The third area in which he really was a path breaker in many ways was his relationship with African Americans. It began with his relationship with Booker T. Washington, which really started in 1910. He, as a result of his reading the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, and then he met Washington, and he got on the board of Tuskegee, and as a result of a suggestion that Washington made, he first agreed to give a sum of money to help Black private schools in the South, and then later agreed to create a fund to help Black private schools in the South. And then, as a result of a suggestion of Booker T. Washington's, he agreed that some of that money could be expended to build 5 public schools for African Americans. And this led to a program which ended up with the creation of over 5,300 schools in the rural South for African Americans. These were built in 15 southern states. And the thing that's interesting about them is that they lasted all the way up until the Civil Rights era. So why did he agree to build segregated schools? He didn't agree. He didn't like the idea of segregation, but he was a businessman and he wanted to get things done. And in America of that era, he couldn't possibly have built integrated schools. The KKK would have come along and bombed them. A few Rosenwald schools were bombed, but nevertheless, some of them were rebuilt. And in any case, they had a really impressive impact on African Americans. And so he, in many ways, contributed a great deal to African American history. So these are the 3 areas which I think are really important and significant. In terms of Hyde Park, of course, he had an enormous importance. He had his home in Hyde Park. He built the home at 4901 Ellis Avenue, which is still there. In 1902, it was designed by the architect Nimmons and Fellows, who later built the Sears plant on Homan Avenue. And it's a sort of industrial looking building. And my mother, who was practically born there, used to call it the old pickle factory. But, and interestingly enough, the Adler home was built on Greenwood, and he built a home for his mother, whom he greatly admired and used to visit every day when he was in Chicago. And that was right next door on Greenwood also. One of the things that I should have told you earlier was that I didn't really know very much about my grandfather when I began the research on this book. There were some stories that I heard from my mother, one of which was that when she was a girl, she and her younger brother, William, used to walk to the lab school all the way from 49th and Ellis with their father, JR, and they would walk a block and run a block, and JR's chauffeur would be right behind, waiting to take him to the Sears plant on Hoban Avenue once the kids were in school. He was responsible for, he was very involved with the University of Chicago. He became a trustee in 1910 and was a trustee until his death in 1932. Aside from Rosenwald Hall, which he gave to as part of a 50th birthday series of gifts to a number of different organizations. And he gave money to the University of Chicago for a building, and they had to decide what they wanted it for. And the decision was to make it the Department of Geology and Geography, and they decided to name it after him. He didn't like having buildings named after him. But at the time that the decision was made to name the building after him, he was in Egypt, visiting Breasted and also going to Palestine. And he couldn't easily get in touch with the folks at the university to tell them not to name the building after him, so he just let it go. He also was partly responsible for the building of Burton Judson and a number of other things. But I think the most interesting thing that he did for the university was that in 1925, the university was engaged in one of the earlier capital campaigns that a university got involved in. And he was asked to make a substantial contribution. But remember, he didn't like what he called perpetuity. So he didn't want to give to the university's endowment. And so what he decided to do was to give $1 million in 3 installments, which was to be paid out over in 3 installments. And this money had to be, it could be used for, it had to last for 10 years. And it could be used for the interest had to be expended and a certain portion of the principal every year. And it could be used for anything that the faculty or the trustees of the university wanted to spend it on, whether it was for students, for travel, for buildings and grounds, it didn't matter. It could be used for anything. And he added another $1 million to that. And also, he thought that he was doing something really innovative in education and that others would follow him, but nobody else has ever done anything quite like that since. The other important thing that he did in Hyde Park, of course, is the creation of the Museum of Science and Industry. This was his idea. He got it because on a trip to Europe with his family, he went with his 2 younger children to visit one of the older children who was studying in Vienna. And they stopped in Munich for some time. And the 2 children were very bored in Munich. And so he told Marion, my mother, and William that he would spend 1 day a week doing whatever each child wanted to do. And the only thing that William wanted to do was to go to this new museum in Munich, which was called the Deutsches Museum, and which was the prototype of the Museum of Science and Industry, where you could push buttons and things would move. And William found it very exciting. And JR saw a lot of this museum and decided that Chicago, actually the United States, but particularly Chicago, ought to have something like it. And so after he retired as CEO of Sears in 1924, he had some time to devote to this, and he decided to create the Museum of Science and Industry. He got a board together, and which he didn't serve on, actually. And one of the only sad things in his life was that he didn't live to see the opening of the museum, which really first opened its doors to the public in 1933. He put, of course, it was started during the Depression. And so although he hoped to get others to contribute to it, very few did. And so he and his estate and other members of the family contributed the first $10 million, which really got the Museum of Science and Industry going until the early 40s. So now, of course, it's one of the great prides of Hyde Park. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about some of you have heard that there's a move afoot to create a Julius Rosenwald National Park, which would consist of examples of some of the Rosenwald schools, perhaps one from each of the 15 states. And there's a bill in Congress to create this. And so I've been asked to say what I think of it. Of course, I'd like to know what you think of it too. My feeling is I have a hard time getting my head around this idea. I think it's an interesting idea. I don't see how you can exactly do it. I think the idea is to have a sort of headquarters in Chicago, perhaps at the Museum of Science and Industry, perhaps at the Rosenwald houses on Michigan Avenue, which he created in 1928-29, which was the first housing complex, if you will, built specifically for African Americans, which has been restored and is now called the Rosenwald. So I don't know where the headquarters would be, but it's an interesting notion. I think the government has a lot of other things on its plate at the moment and needs for money. And I'm not sure that this is the right time to propose this. Nevertheless, I think it's a good idea. And I hope that at some point, maybe it will come to fruition. I think that's all I really wanted to say, but if there are, I certainly hope that there are lots of questions because I'm eager to answer them. Hello?
All right, well, thank you so much, Peter. Anybody, I've muted everybody, so please unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Okay, I see Susan is trying to talk. Susan, unmute yourself, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so back to your Rosenwald schools. Have you met many people who are descendants of people who went to Rosenwald schools?
Yes, I've met quite a number. Some of them are very elderly. And interestingly enough, some of the schools, some even that have disappeared, have what are called Rosenwald Days, I guess. I attended a dinner in Chicago. I think it was even before the book was published, where the alumni or children or grandchildren of alumni of Rosenwald School, of this particular Rosenwald School, I believe it was in Kentucky, got together and they did it every couple of years in some location. I've met some of the teachers while they were still alive. They really were quite extraordinary. And it's interesting to me how, I mean, these schools were not necessarily great schools. I mean, there was a reason that the Supreme Court agreed that separate doesn't always mean equal. But everybody tried very hard, and there was such a sense of community around these schools. They were really a community center. And so it was very interesting to meet them and hear their stories. And so it's truly it was a great experience to do that. It really was.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, everybody who has got your hands raised, I see Joan does, I see Rosalie does, please unmute yourself. Or maybe I have to do it for you. Let me just try to do this here.
I've been muted. Now I'm unmuted. May I speak?
Now, okay, Joan, you have the floor.
Okay. Peter, I saw a film about your grandfather, and one thing there impressed me so much, the fact that he did not just throw money at a place and say, build a school. Here's the money. What he did was involve the community. He went to the town and said, would you like to have a school for Black children? I will give you money to do it. if I'll give you money with which you'll buy provisions, but you need to build it. And this meant that Black people actually physically built the churches. So everybody, the whole community, from the takers and the givers, were all involved in it together. And I think community was the greatest thing that held all that together.
Yes, you're right. But actually, he didn't go to every town. And there was a whole formula that was, he put up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the money. The rest of the money, part of it had to, African Americans put up what turned out to be an equal amount. In fact, African Americans gave more money overall for the schools than he did. But the rest of the money came from state and local governments. And the reason for that is that there was a Rockefeller Foundation, which, not the Rockefeller Foundation, but a Rockefeller Foundation called the General Education Board, which was created in the very early 1900s, and which he wasn't involved in it, but he knew about it. And one of the things that, interestingly enough, it was supposed to give money for education for both Blacks and whites. But initially, it only gave money to whites. And Rockefeller finally got involved and he said, we have to do something for Blacks. And so what he did was to give money for state and local governments to hire a person who was called the Director of Negro Education in each state that the General Education Board dealt with. And it was because of these people, who of course were all white males, that money was ultimately given to the Rosenwald schools. But it was done on a matching basis. It was a matching grant. So Rosenwald would give the initial 1/4, say, and then they would apply for the state funds. But that didn't make it any less a community enterprise. Interestingly enough, initially, they hired one of Booker T. Washington's sons to go around to the communities and ask them, do you want a school? And there were some communities that said, no, we don't. We don't want to bother with it. It's too much trouble, too much. We have to get the money for it, other monies. So there were, not every community could do it. Also, as I've indicated, these schools were in rural areas. They weren't in cities, with a couple of rare exceptions. And ultimately, they all had the same kind of floor plan with huge windows, because this was before TVA and they were in rural areas. And so there was no electricity. They had to have sunlight. They had privies. There were no, and outhouses. There was no indoor plumbing, etc. So these schools were rudimentary, but they were effective, and they did create a sense of community.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fran, you want to unmute yourself?
Do what?
I see Fran has her hand up. Fran, unmute yourself.
Claire, there's a button you have to press on the screen that says unmute.
Yeah.
Who is she?
Okay, Joe,
Yes.
you.
Yes,
Okay.
I was curious that Indiana University Press published the book, which I had forgotten because I have a copy, and I'm a graduate of Indiana University. But I'm surprised that to say the University of Chicago Press wouldn't have been interested because of his being such an important person in Chicago. What's the history of your trying to find a publisher for the book?
Okay, that's an interesting question. My first hope was that the University of Chicago Press would publish it, but I submitted the manuscript to them, which was a good bit longer than the book that you have. And, you know, they sent back comments, which they're perfectly free to do, but they're anonymous. And they said, you must do every single one of the things, every single one of these things that we have suggested in the comments, or we won't publish it. Well, some of the things that they suggested, I really didn't agree with, but it was all anonymous. And they weren't going to tell me who had suggested it. And so I said, I'm sorry, I don't think I can do all these things. And they said, that's fine, we're not publishing it. But I had gone to the University of Indiana and had given a talk. And after the talk, somebody said, what are your plans for publication? And I said, well, I'm submitting it to the University of Chicago Press. So the fellow said, well, you know, they have a school on philanthropy, a whole program devoted to philanthropy. So they said, well, listen, if they don't want to publish it, don't forget about us. So when the University of Chicago put these roadblocks, as I saw them, in my way, I turned to Indiana and sent them the manuscript, and they said, we'll publish it, but you have to cut it by a third. That was the hardest thing I had to do. Writing it was not that difficult, but cutting that book down to one third of its size, that was really hard. There were things I desperately wanted to put in there, but I decided that I just had to make it only about JR, and everything else was really extraneous. And I'm actually glad it turned out that way. I think it turned out to be a better book.
So Peter, they let you decide what to cut. They didn't tell you what to cut.
They did not tell me what to cut. They said, you have to do it. So, I also have to say that, and I don't know if this is true of publishing today or not, but I may have had an editor, but as far as I know, I had almost no contact with that editor, and I don't think that person actually edited anything.
But I'm just interested to hear that you had control over what was cut and what was not cut. Now, Fran, I think you're unmuted now. You can ask your question.
Okay,
Yes, Fran.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, as a former teacher, I'm very interested in the kind of curriculum, what was taught in these schools. I'm sure it was a variety of things. And where did the teachers come from?
Well, I think some of the teachers, you know, there was an interesting system because a philanthropist before JR gave money for sort of itinerant teachers whose job was to teach teachers, but they didn't, I mean, there weren't big programs set up even at Black universities to do that. And so these teachers would spend a little bit of time in each school and kind of roam around. And this was before the Rosenwald schools got going. And so they were used, of course, in Rosenwald schools. What was taught in these schools was, you know, it's interesting because it was the W.E.B. Du Bois who believed that, you know, you needed to teach the same sorts of things, Latin and Greek and everything that was taught in white schools. Booker T. Washington believed that the schools should teach Blacks to get the kind of jobs that Blacks could get at that time. But and that was okay with whites at that time, but he didn't really limit himself to that. And so they were taught the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and other things as well. I'm certain. They could do plays. They had to help out around the school with gardens and things like that. I'm sure that was one of the things that they learned how to do. And I mean, it was, in a sense, it was sort of an insidious way of getting back at the Jim Crow whites in the South, because these schools were teaching things beyond just, they weren't teaching Latin and Greek, but they did a good job up to a point of teaching kids. And a number of kids who went to Rosenwald schools went on to, these were primarily primary schools, and many of them went on to high schools, and many others went on to universities. So, I mean, they created or were essential in helping to create a Black middle class in the 20s and 30s and 40s and even 50s.
Yeah, am I still on?
Thank you. Fred, Richard has the floor next. Richard?
Oh, sure. Well, I came tonight partly to acknowledge a debt to Peter for this this splendid book. I like you. I think I had forgotten that piece of the story, that you had taken over the project from someone else, because that's what I did in 2006. My friend and former teacher, Robert Bone, had been working on a book that's now called The Muse in Bronzeville. And he worked he had only the benefit of Wenger's biography and some materials at Fisk University. So when I discovered your book, the same year I got engaged with this project, 2006, it was a splendid, eye-opening edition, particularly the way you traced Rosenwald's connections with Booker T. Washington.
Why not?
That was especially helpful. And as you talked about the philanthropy, it occurred to me that in the North, the Rosenwald Foundation was supporting the construction of YMCAs. And
yes,
that community investment that you and actually someone else spoke about, I wondered if that was the prototype for today's challenge grant. That
no, I mean, Rosenwald didn't create the challenge grant.
No?
Rockefeller really did that, I think.
Okay.
But he thought it was truly important, and he tried to raise it, if you will, to another level.
Mm-hmm.
There was something else I was going to say about the schools, and I can't quite remember exactly what it was. But perhaps it'll come to me in another question. But as far as the YMCAs are concerned, they started before the schools did. That's how the first thing that happened after he read the biography of Booker T. Washington, and also another book that was very influential for him, was that shortly after he finished these two books, which both dealt with African Americans, and by the way, I think the Black population of Chicago in 1910 was about 3%. So they weren't really a huge part on his radar screen. He was visited by people from the YMCA at the Sears plant who asked if he would contribute to the building of a Black YMCA in Chicago. And that's where, right on the spot, which was unusual for a fundraising, I assure you, he agreed to give this challenge grant to build not only a Black YMCA, but any YMCA in the country that could raise an additional $75,000 to build a Black Y. And this was the stimulus for how he met Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington spoke at a YMCA dinner, and that's how the two of them actually met. But the YMCA program ended in the building of 35 YW or YMCAs in cities all across America, not only big cities, but even small ones like Montclair, New Jersey, and places. And some of the YMCAs actually have Black architects, like one in California. So it was a really important and interesting program. It too, the YMCAs too were segregated, but again, I doubt that they could have been built if the urge had been to integrate them. I think the other thing I wanted to mention was Fisk University, which is where the papers of the Rosenwald Fund are stored, and where I spent a fair amount of time going through the material that had to do with JR.
I want to enter one other thread here that's worth talking about. Just invite you to talk about the fellowship program.
Oh, yes.
For any of us who are working on African American creative expression, the fellowships were helped support and launch most of the major Black writers, visual artists, intellectuals of the 1930s, 40s. Well, it ended in 48.
It did.
And it was launched in Rosenwald's lifetime.
It was launched in 1928 or 9.
Yeah.
And actually the impetus from it came from Edwin Embry, who was the head of the Rosenwald, who was appointed head of the Rosenwald Fund in 1928. Rosenwald stole him from the Rockefeller Foundation. And he had very interesting thoughts. And he was the one who suggested the idea of the fellowship program, which, as you say, really created the sort of, it was like a MacArthur Genius Award several decades before its time. And the interesting thing about it is that the recipients didn't have to do anything for it. You know, they just got the money, which wasn't a huge amount. It was, I think, maybe somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000. But in those days, especially in the Depression, that was a lot of money. You could do a lot with that. And so, for example, Zora Neale Hurston, who won a Rosenwald Fellowship, used it to study anthropology, which I thought was interesting.
Thank you.
All right. I think it's Jamie or Chet. I'm not sure which of you, but.
Yeah, I had a question on what I'd like to comment on a story that I heard and what you think about it. I know initially the stores were mail order to lots of farmers and that, but I've heard also that in the South particularly, because Blacks had problems buying things at stores, particularly white stores, that they used the Sears catalog quite a bit to buy things because it was color differences. Couldn't tell.
That's absolutely true, except that, of course, all the pictures of people in the catalog were all of white. But you're absolutely right. Anybody could buy anything they wanted from the Sears catalog, as long as they had the money, of course. But no, that's absolutely true. However, you know, there were lots of small mom and pop stores that suffered as a result of that. And I mean, don't forget that Sears was the largest retail establishment in the world once Rosenwald had built it up. I mean, it was like the Amazon of its day.
Walmart.
Well, Walmart, but I think more like Amazon, really, because of the whole distribution system and everything. It was quite amazing.
Okay, Sam, I can see you're talking. Sam, you have to unmute yourself. Sam.
I've done it now.
All right, thank you.
I would like to speak for a moment on Rosenthal's method of leadership. And as introduction, let me say that my father was the public relations director of the Illinois Agricultural Association, which in this state is the Farm Bureau. So when Rosenthal formed a agricultural research association and hired my father to be its director, their mission was to get into this newfangled deal called radio, and founded WLS, world's largest store, for the benefit of rural farmers that are isolated out in the country. Now, having said that, it is my understanding from my father that Rosenthal himself Leader, as Peter has just told us, is the largest retail in the world, never made operational decisions. What he did, he established principles far removed from the operational aspect. This is all very relevant to today's political situation. He laid down the principles in a way that then inspired all his employees, certainly all his executives, and this went down level after level, to live up to these high principles, the high standards that he established. Now, one more thing on that. These principles were in two layers, we might say. One of them was for the worthy causes to be achieved. That is the objective. He put down principles for the objective of what was to be accomplished. The other thing is on your pathway that you're allowed to accomplish it. So as I understand it from my parents, and this was during the period of time that I was born into this world, that Rosenthal would never approve
Rosenwald.
that the means, that the ends justify the means. No, if you have a worthy end, it does not justify any means to get there. That your path to achieve a worthy objective must equally be a worthwhile path. And it is with such things that do inspire people. If you just sit there and make the operational decisions, so what? You get one chairman of the board, another chairman of the board. But I think this is what elevated Rosenthal into a very, very special high place in the American corporate world. I've said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree with you.
Well, I say it not in praise, but we can't say this about, you point to an American corporation leadership that has any spark of that now today. And I don't see it, but it's the same way that FDR got us through the Depression, that Winston Churchill steered the English ship over the seas of the war and so forth. And that's where he belongs. And it's for the reason that they put down high principles, and you must get there by a meritorious pathway.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Dottie?
I worked at the Museum of Science and Industry from 1979 to 83, in the days when the museum was free to the public. And I certainly understand why the museum had to, create admission fees eventually. But when my colleagues and I worked there, we were very proud to be at a museum whose mission was to be free and open to the public and to introduce everyday man to science and technology. And I always admired that very much about JR. We never called him JR, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's also interesting, of course, that he had the opportunity to have his name on the building, and he turned it down. It had been suggested, and he agreed to it for about a couple of weeks, and then he decided to change it. And that was a big deal because the papers to name the museum had already been sent down to Springfield. And it took a couple of years to change it so that its name became the Museum of Science and Industry. But he believed that, I mean, he was a relatively self-effacing man, or he wouldn't have insisted that his foundation end. And he believed that this was a museum that the emphasis shouldn't be on him. It should be a museum for everybody.
Right.
I don't know what he would have thought about their charging money for it, nor do I know what he would have thought about somebody else naming it after themselves, as has been done. But I was asked about that by David Messina, and I said that JR did not want it named after him, so I certainly didn't think it should be named for him, and I wasn't going to have it named after me, so it was okay if Ken Griffin was going to have spent the amount of money that he has spent to have the building named after him.
All right, Roberta.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. Great
Hi,
talk.
Roberta.
So, Peter, one of the things that occurred to me tonight was about the Black YMCAs, because Julius Rosenwald was a very out there Jew and very proud of his being Jewish. Maybe you can speak about his interfaith, ecumenical, however you want to put it, about his brotherhood ideas, about bringing people together and being able to support, the Black YMCAs.
Right. Well, I mean, he did get a little bit of pushback initially from some Jews, unfortunately, who thought, why is he giving money to this Christian organization instead of to Palestine? He was already giving money to Palestine and giving money to Jewish organizations. And, there was a need. He was asked to give money to this. He had given, actually, I failed to say that his initial contribution to a YMCA was to the Hyde Park YMCA before he began to give money for Africa. And this was only small amounts before he began giving to this program that he created to give to Black YMCAs. But I mean, you're right. He was Jewish, but he didn't, this wasn't going to be any bar to him. The other thing is that one of the things I tried to do in the book was to trace the evolution of his thinking about Blacks, because when at the very, very beginning, he really didn't know very much about African Americans. And some people that he knew referred to them as Schwarze, which of course means black in German, but which was sort of a term of abuse. But he quickly, as soon as he got to know some, including Booker T. Washington, his feelings for them changed dramatically. I mean, I think it's really important to realize that he personally felt, I believe, that Blacks and whites should be treated as equals, which was not an opinion that an enormous number of whites felt. Some did, but not large numbers in the 20s and 30s or teens when he first started thinking that way.
Just to follow up, Peter, in the documentary, I think there was mention of the council that he was part of after the race riots in Chicago, 1919.
Right. The governor created a task force to assess the race riots of 1919, and he sat on that commission and was responsible for publishing the results of it, which I guess he hoped would get wide circulation. I don't think it did, but supposedly it did influence one person who read it, who was Gunnar Myrdal, and who used it as a source for the American Dilemma when he wrote that work in the 1940s. Also, sitting on the task force gave him the inspiration to build what he called the Michigan Boulevard Garden Apartments, which is now called the Rosenwald homes. And so that, I think that was he had come up with the idea before the race riots, but he got involved in the housing section of the commission and began to realize what the tremendous need was for housing in the Black community.
Right,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Hi. Peter, yes, I want to expound a little bit on that. I heard a presentation by some other relatives of yours over at the Logan Center a couple of years ago. And the idea of the building the Rosenwald building was, it came from him traveling from Hyde Park over to the Sears Roebuck building and going through the dilapidated areas of the Black metropolis area at that time, which is now Bronzeville. And that's what gave him the idea and influenced him to get into housing and to build the Rosenwald complex there.
Right. In fact, I said that in my book, and I think I said it at that evening at the Logan Center.
Oh, that's where
So,
okay, I did see you there, right?
There.
I
Yeah.
unfortunately haven't got your book. I haven't gotten the book, but yeah, I just wanted to bring that out. I haven't gotten the book yet, yeah.
Okay, it's still available in paperback.
I know. I was just getting that.
Do so, but no, I mean, and that, I think that's really an interesting point. I mean, the fact that this idea came to him I think in 1915, there was an article published in the Black newspaper in Chicago saying that Julius Rosenwald wanted to build a housing complex for African Americans. At that time, he didn't have a site or anything. And it really didn't get off the ground, so to speak, until around 1928. And then this was one of the few things which he put all of his own money into. And he did it thinking that he didn't do it as a nonprofit venture. He did it as a business venture, thinking that he would get a 5% rate of return from it. Unfortunately, the Depression hit shortly after the building opened.
Right.
All right. Joan?
Yes, I just wanted to say I was impressed by the Rosenwald apartments when they began. Were a community. They were not just apartments. It was not just housing, but there was, am I right, Peter? There was a kindergarten, there was social space, there was shopping. So it was an inclusive thing.
Yes, and in fact, the first manager of it was, Valerie Jarrett's grandfather.
Robert Taylor?
Robert Taylor, exactly, who was brought up from Tuskegee, where his father had been the architect of the Rosenwald School, interestingly enough, right. But you're right, there was a kindergarten where my mother volunteered for a number of years. I talked to many people, a number of people who had lived in the Rosenwald as children. And that was a fascinating experience. I mean, they had ballet classes there. They had stargazing on summer nights. They had all kinds of, there were all kinds of amenities there. But they went to the kids went to the local public school, and there were the kids who were not in that school resented them. So one person I talked to said that that's how he learned how to run, because he was chased from the school by the kids who were jealous of him for living in the Rosenwald.
They had a lot of very famous people living in that building in there also. And the one thing I remember about it is walking up to the 5th floor, to the top floor. I had a relative that lived there, and they lived on the top floor. And I mean, that was like really something. But I'm so happy that they didn't sell it or demolish it or anything after the incident there with the gas pipe. But now I think it's a mixed use building. It's part seniors and part families.
Right.
Mixed income building.
Right, and they've done a beautiful job in restoring it.
Yeah, they did.
They really did.
It's also been on the Open House Chicago tours the last well, this year they couldn't do it in person, but
Right.
I went through it a couple of years ago. It was opened and it's been beautifully restored.
Yeah, it's magnificent. And they were going to tear it down. I mean, there's no question about it. And we owe a debt to a woman named Bobby Johnson, who had lived there and worked tirelessly to make sure it wasn't, and also to the current alderman, who has done a terrific job in making sure that that building was restored. So we're fortunate that it has ended the way it did.
All right. Richard, I see you have another question.
Okay.
You need to unmute, yeah.
Mute. Unmute.
Trying. Done.
There we go.
Okay. Now, Peter, once again, it's been a while since I've read the book, but I just recalled thinking Rosenwald's was an admirable life, a life fully worth living. And you document that. I wonder, I think, or I recall occasionally thinking, was there anything he did that you found in your research that you would say was wrong? Whether that was morally compromised or simply an error in judgment?
Yes, there are several things. I mean, first of all, the movie is great. I love the movie, but it presents a picture of Rosenwald as this sort of saint, and he wasn't. He was a human being like any other. He had his moments of rage, which one person described as passing like a thunderstorm. And he did make some errors. The most famous, really, and most interesting was he was a devoted Republican, and he in the progressive mold of Teddy Roosevelt. And there was a Senator, Frank Smith, who from Illinois, who was up for re-election, and it was clear that this man was corrupt. And so JR decided to, first he decided to find somebody who would run against him, but before that, he went to see Frank Smith, and he offered him, I think, somewhere close to $800,000 of Sears stock if he would withdraw from the race. Now, we regarded this as a noble gesture, right? Because he was going to, if it's successful, he was going to get rid of a clearly corrupt man, right? But I think today we might look at it in a slightly different light. There are other instances, I think, of rather poor judgment on his part, but I can give them to you if you want, but maybe there are other questions.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
Couple screens over.
Mr. Rosenstein? Unmute, please.
Oh, I have a couple of questions. One is in the past and one's in the future.
Okay.
Is there anything in the book which talks about Julius Rosenwald's visit to Munich? Because there he met Oscar von Miller, who had founded the Deutsches Museum. When I lived in Munich, I lived a couple of blocks away from the Deutsches Museum. And I think there's a picture there of Rosenwald meeting with Oscar von Miller, the engineer who founded the Deutsches Museum. And so do you have any discussion in the book of his visit to Munich and how he came to meet Oscar von Miller? The other thing I'm interested in is we're facing.
Can I answer that now? And then you can ask the second question.
Sure.
Which is, I mean, as I described, he got the idea for the Museum of Science and Industry because he visited Munich in 1910, and his son Bill wanted to go only to that museum. But at that time, I don't think he introduced himself to von Miller. When he got to meet him was in the mid-20s, when he was trying to establish the Museum of Science and Industry. And I think he tried to bring von Müller over to this country, not to head it, but simply to advise him. But that's all I really know about it.
Well, you know, it was a privilege in my life to have grown up near the Museum of Science and Industry, and then later years when I was working in Munich for a couple of years to live near the Deutsches Museum. So that will be part of my fabric forever, both those wonderful museums. The other thing I'm wondering about, you know, we're faced with these problems of climate change today and needing to transition away from fossil fuels, nuclear fission energy, to renewables. What do you think Julius Rosenwald's role would be today if he were among us and confronting these problems of climate change and also this viral pandemic? What leadership role do you think he would be taking today were he among us? And can we learn anything from his experience?
Well, as a matter of fact, he was very interested in nature, although his wife Gussie, whom I'm sorry I haven't mentioned, though I should have, she was a big influence on him. I can get to her later, but he was interested in nature. He was involved in preserving preserving the Indiana dunes. There was a movement to preserve the dunes, and he was involved in that. He gave money for a trail in Glacier National Park, which was named after him supposedly, although I've been to Glacier and I never saw the trail, but that doesn't matter. I mean, the fact that he liked hiking and nature is certainly true. So I think he would have been maybe not in favor of the Green New Deal, but I think he would have been, he looked kindly on what is happening in that sphere. As far as the pandemic, I don't know. You know, it's interesting, there's no reference in the research that I did to the flu epidemic of 1918. I don't know what he thought of it. I don't think anyone in his family got it, fortunately. So I can't really answer that question. I mean, I imagine, you know, he would have tried to he would have believed that it would be important to take a good leadership role, I'm sure, but it's hard to speculate about something like that.
All right, any other questions? Well, this has been a really wonderful, Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a wonderful discussion. We've all enjoyed it very much. And it's a great book. And we thank you again. And
thank you.
I'm going to segue now into, because we are fortunate to have our next book club author here with us tonight, who is Richard Courage, who is going to join us in January because we do not have a December book club meeting. So Richard will join us in January with Christopher Robert Reed, and the subject for that book club is Black History and Arts in Chicago. And there are several wonderful books that we're going to be discussing, including The Muse in Bronzeville, Richard's book, The Roots of the Black Chicago Renaissance, which Richard, I think, has just been recently published. Yes, you're muted. Black Chicago's First Century by Christopher Reed, and All the World is Here, The Black Presence in the White City, which we have covered that topic in other book club meetings, but it will be nice to revisit it in January. So thank you all for attending tonight. And most thank you to Peter, who and Peter, I have to tell you, I wanted to tonight do a preview of the Julius Rosenwald film, and I sent an email to the National Center for Jewish Film about was there any way we could stream this film, and I never heard back from them, and that was about a month ago. So anyway, I thought that would have been a nice introduction to this meeting, but you did. We are so grateful for your presentation tonight and your discussion. And so thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you,
everyone.
Peter, it
Thanks
was
very much.
terrific.
The
Very
film is
excellent.
90 minutes long, so it might have been a little much.
Well, it's past most of our bedtimes, but that's okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, good night, everybody, and see you in January.
Good night.
Good night.